The rain had not stopped for 7 days. The camp lay somewhere between Okinawa's scarred hills and the Pacific's gray horizon, a patch of barbed wire, rusted tin roofs, and the sour smell of boiled rations. The war was over, but for the hundreds of Japanese prisoners held there, it did not feel like peace. It felt like a suspended breath between shame and survival. At dawn that morning, a group of American soldiers marched toward the female barracks with crates of food and medical supplies. Inside, the women stirred, their faces pale, their hair matted under faded headscarves. They had once been nurses, typists, and factory aides in the Imperial Army. Now, they were prisoners, stripped of their rank and pride. The guards, young Americans barely in their 20s, moved with quiet discipline. One of them, Sergeant Daniel Harper, carried a box labeled U.S. Army Relief Aid. His blue eyes darted from face to face, unsure whether to meet their gaze. Another soldier, Private James Collins, whistled lowly as he passed, trying to keep his nerves at bay. They were used to enemy soldiers, not enemy women. And then, silence broke. From one of the wooden huts emerged Aiko Tanaka, a woman of 27, tall, graceful even in her torn khaki uniform. She stepped forward, her bare feet sinking into the wet ground, her posture straight as a blade. Her voice, though soft, carried across the camp. "Are you the men who feed us now?" Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected her to speak English. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally. "Relief supplies, medical kits, and rations. Orders from HQ." She studied him. Behind her, the other women watched like shadows, some curious, others resentful. The Japanese had told them Americans were monsters, soulless invaders who would violate and destroy them. Yet these men looked human, clean, even gentle. Daniel handed her a can of soup. Their fingers brushed, briefly, unintentionally. She flinched, but didn't pull back. And at that moment, something changed. Viewers, imagine this. If you were once told your enemies were demons, and then one looked at you not with hatred, but with pity, would your heart stay loyal to your homeland, or would it betray you in silence? Over the next weeks, the rain gave way to sunlight. The Americans built a small infirmary. They patched roofs, dug drainage ditches, and started a makeshift kitchen. The camp softened. Hunger lessened. Fear receded. And with that came the danger no one had prepared for: affection. Aiko watched Daniel every morning as he distributed the rations. He wasn't like the other guards. He didn't leer. He didn't mock. He simply did his job, sometimes pausing to teach English words to the younger POWs. One afternoon, she approached him carrying a torn piece of cloth. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "this belongs to your jacket. I stitched it back." Daniel looked at the fabric, his unit patch. It must have come loose during work detail. She'd repaired it carefully with red thread. He smiled. "Thank you, miss." "Aiko," she said. "Aiko Tanaka." He nodded. "Daniel." Their names hung in the air like forbidden fruit. That night, Aiko sat by the barack window. She heard the ocean breathing in the dark, the faint hum of an American radio from the officer's hut, and laughter, light, easy laughter. The sound pierced her chest. All her life she'd been told Americans were beasts. But beasts didn't bring medicine to the sick or bury the dead with respect. She began to wonder if everything she'd believed about loyalty was a lie in another part of the camp. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe, one of the few female American nurses stationed there, noticed the change too. "Daniel," she said one evening, cleaning her medical instruments, "you're getting too close. Command doesn't want friendly relations." He shrugged. "They're starving women, Rachel. Not soldiers." "They were soldiers once," she reminded him. "Don't forget what happened in Manila." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen the corpses, the massacres, but he'd also seen these women. Thin, trembling, broken by a war that had used them and thrown them away. Still, Rachel was right. Compassion could blur into something else, something dangerous. Weeks turned to months. The camp transformed. The POWs began singing again, mending clothes, tending a small garden behind the barracks. They made dolls from scraps of cloth, tiny tokens of life returning, and slowly, Aiko's heart betrayed her. It started with glances, then smiles, then quiet moments when Daniel slipped her extra bread or a warm coat. The others noticed. Some whispered that she was a traitor. Others envied her courage, but Aiko didn't care. For the first time since the war began, She felt human. Point one dusk, while the sky burned crimson over the sea. She spoke to him through the fence. "Daniel," she said, "do you hate us?" He looked at her for a long time. "No, I hate the war." She hesitated, then whispered, "Then, could you ever forgive us?" He didn't answer immediately. The surf crashed. Somewhere, a gull screamed. Finally he said, "I think forgiveness starts when we stop seeing each other as enemies." She smiled, and her eyes glistened. That night, she couldn't sleep. I in the barracks. Whispers spread. Not just about Aiko and Daniel, but about the other women too. They had begun writing letters, little notes of affection, gratitude, curiosity, addressed to the American guards. It was harmless at first. Then it wasn't. Point one morning, Lieutenant Monroe found a bundle of letters hidden under a food crate, all written by female POWs, all addressed to the soldiers. Some were poems, some were confessions, some were proposals. She brought them straight to Daniel. "Read them," she said bitterly. "Your angels have fallen in love with their jailers." Daniel scanned the papers. "Dear Sergeant, I know my country lost, but my heart cannot stop thinking of you. Private Collins, your kindness is warmer than our homeland sun. To the American who smiled at me, I will wait for you even if you never return." He sighed. "They're just trying to survive." Rachel slammed the table. "No, Daniel, they're trying to forget. You feed them, they see hope. You smile, they see love. But what happens when we leave? When orders come to transfer them to another island?" Daniel had no answer. That evening, he avoided Aiko. She noticed when she called his name through the fence. He didn't turn. Something inside her broke. Why the next morning, the camp was buzzing. Point three women had done something unthinkable. They had proposed marriage to American soldiers, openly, through the interpreter. They claimed they no longer wished to return to Japan. They wanted to start anew in the United States. The interpreter was stunned. The officers furious. Word reached headquarters within hours that the Americans, it was scandalous. To the Japanese, it was sacrilege. Daniel found Aiko by the garden later that day. Her eyes were red. She'd heard the news. "They rejected them," she said flatly. "All three. Turned them down in front of everyone." He tried to speak, but she cut him off. "Why? Because we are the defeated? Because we are unworthy?" "Aiko," she laughed bitterly. "You said forgiveness begins when we stop seeing each other as enemies. Was that a lie?" Daniel clenched his fists. "I'm a soldier, Aiko. I follow orders. It's not that simple." Tears streaked her dirt-covered cheeks. "It never is." That night, under the same moon that had once witnessed Hiroshima's burning, Aiko wrote her own letter. She didn't give it to him. She hid it under the roots of the garden's only cherry sapling. If love is forbidden between enemies, then perhaps peace will never be real. I only wanted to know if hearts can heal faster than nations. The next morning, the American command ordered immediate transfers. The war was long over. But its ghosts refused to die quietly as the trucks lined up and the women were marched aboard. Daniel stood watching. Aiko looked back once. Their eyes met through a veil of dust and sunlight. Neither waved, neither spoke, but both understood. The war had ended for the world, not for them. Viewers, what would you have done? If compassion bloomed in the ruins of hatred, would you call it betrayal or rebirth? Would you dare to love your enemy, knowing the world would never forgive you? And as the convoy rolled toward the coast, a sudden gust of wind scattered something small and fragile across the yard. Letters, hundreds of them, fluttering like white birds. The American soldiers turned away. They didn't pick them up. They didn't need to. They already knew what they said. The sea was restless that morning, gray and foaming against the iron hull of the transport ship that carried the women away from Okinawa. Inside the hold, the air was thick with diesel fumes and salt. The prisoners sat in rows, shackled loosely at the wrists, their eyes hollow. Among them, Aiko Tanaka stared through a porthole streaked with condensation. Her reflection looked ghostly, thin, bruised, her once dark hair dulled to the color of ash. She felt every mile of the voyage like a punishment carved into her ribs. For 3 nights, she did not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face in the storm light, his lips moving but his voice drowned by the roar of departing trucks. She had thought she was strong enough to bear anything, but she had not imagined love as another kind of captivity. The ship reached Luzon under heavy clouds. U.S. Army trucks waited at the dock. engines idling. The women were herded ashore under guard, their meager belongings clutched to their chests. The road to the new camp wound through broken villages where the ruins still smoldered from old battles. Filipino children watched silently from doorways. The air smelled of wet soil and old fire. When they arrived, the new camp felt colder despite the tropical heat. It was smaller, surrounded by a bamboo fence and sentries with fixed bayonets. The commandant was a man named Captain Henry Ross, a sharp-featured officer with eyes like winter steel. He read from a clipboard as they lined up. His voice was flat, bureaucratic, devoid of empathy. You are prisoners of the United States Armed Forces. You will be treated according to Geneva rules. You will work. You will obey. You will not fraternize with guards or civilian personnel. Violations will be punished severely. Dismissed. The women filed into their quarters, rows of rough huts with tin roofs and mud floors. That night, Aiko lay awake listening to the crickets and distant thunder. Somewhere, a woman sobbed quietly. The sound broke her. She turned her face to the wall and whispered Daniel's name into the dark. The following weeks were routine: digging, cleaning, mending uniforms. American rations replaced starvation, but no one smiled. Aiko kept her head down, speaking little. She buried the memory of Okinawa beneath layers of obedience. But memory, like rust, always returns to the surface point. One afternoon, while she scrubbed metal trays by the kitchen tent, she heard someone shouting in English. When she turned, her heart froze. It was Private James Collins, Daniel's old comrade, the same one who used to whistle while handing out food. He was laughing with another soldier near the water barrels. For a moment, she thought she might faint. Collins saw her and blinked, as if unsure he recognized her. Then his face tightened. Later, he approached quietly, glancing around to ensure no officers were near. "Tanaka," he said in a low voice. "You were in Okinawa, weren't you?" She nodded cautiously. "You knew Harper, Sergeant Daniel Harper?" Her throat tightened. "Yes." Collins rubbed the back of his neck. "He got reassigned after you left. He asked me to look out for you if I ever saw your name. Said you were different." The world blurred for a second. She wanted to speak, but all that came out was a whisper. "He's alive." "Yeah. Stateside now. They pulled him back home. War's over for good." Aiko pressed her palm to her chest. The ache there throbbed like a reopened wound. "Did he say anything else?" Collins hesitated. "Only that he was sorry. He didn't get a chance to tell you goodbye." Then the officer's shout cut through the air, and Collins had to leave. But that night, Aiko felt something bloom inside her again. Hope, fragile and dangerous. She began writing again. This time, she hid the letters beneath the loose floorboard of her bunk. She wrote not as a prisoner, but as a woman speaking across oceans. "Daniel, I heard you live. I wish I could see the place where peace looks like more than dust. I am not ashamed of what I feel. They can call it betrayal. I call it survival." She never intended to send it. But fate has its own messengers. One morning, Captain Ross conducted a surprise inspection. He was searching for contraband: knives, radios, cigarettes. When he reached Aiko's bunk, he found the floorboard loose. The letter was in his hand before she could move. "What is this?" His voice was icy. She tried to speak, but he was already reading aloud. The words sounded obscene when spoken in his harsh American accent. "You still writing love notes to your enemies?" Her knees went weak. "It was never meant to." He crumpled the paper. "Do you know what happens to POWs caught conspiring with foreign soldiers?" "I am a prisoner, not a spy," she said desperately. It was only a memory. Ross leaned close, his breath hot and bitter. Memory can be treason. That night, she was dragged to the interrogation shed. The rain hammered the tin roof like machine gun fire. 2 guards stood by while Ross questioned her again, demanding names, intent, everything. When she refused to speak, he slammed his fist into the table. The candle flickered. For a moment, he looked less like an officer and more like a man unraveling. "You think he'd love you if he saw what your army did in Manila?" He hissed. "You think you deserve mercy?" She stared back, trembling but unbroken. If mercy has sides, then the war never ended. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then he laughed, a short, hollow laugh, and walked out. Lock her in isolation. Days passed. The cell was small, damp, and windowless. She survived on a single bowl of rice a day. Yet inside that darkness, something hardened in her. They could strip her of dignity, but not the memory of kindness. She replayed Daniel's voice over and over in her mind until it became prayer. Outside, Collins heard of her punishment. Guilt gnawed at him. He knew she was no spy, but Ross was obsessed with discipline and image. To him, compassion was weakness. Collins tried to plead her case, but the captain silenced him with a single glare. This is a military zone, not a romance novel. On the 10th day, Ross ordered her release. She stepped into sunlight, so bright it blinded her. Her body was frail, her hair tangled, but her eyes burned steady. She walked straight to the garden area where other women were hanging laundry. When they saw her, they fell silent. No one dared ask what had happened. She simply picked up a bucket and resumed work, as if nothing had changed. That evening, Collins approached again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for him to find it." She looked at him. Her lips cracked from thirst, but her voice was calm. "No one ever means for pain to happen. It just finds us." He nodded, ashamed. "If you want me to send a message to Harper, I can." "No," she said quickly. "It's better if he forgets. The world won't forgive a soldier who loves his enemy." Collins tried to protest, but she walked away. She had made her choice. Love, once discovered, had to be buried like a weapon, hidden, but never gone. Weeks later, word spread that the camp would be disbanded. The U.S. command was transferring the remaining POWs to civilian authorities. Papers were signed, trucks prepared. The women whispered about freedom, though none knew where they would go. Japan was in ruins, families gone, cities reduced to ash. What was freedom without a place to return to? The day before departure, Ross called a final assembly. He stood before them with a clipboard, his face expressionless. "Tomorrow you will be transferred to Yokohama. You will be given identification and ration cards. You will not contact American personnel. This order is final." His eyes met Aiko's for a brief second. She thought she saw something flicker there, not hatred, but unease. Perhaps even guilt. That night, as the camp slept, Collins found her near the fence. She was holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth, letters, drawings, scraps of memory. "For you," she said. "Give it to him if you ever meet him again." He took it, unsure what to say. "You'll need these," he said softly. "I have already lived them," she replied. Now they belonged to the sea. When dawn came, the trucks rumbled toward the docks again. Aiko climbed aboard without looking back. The sky was pink and gold, the world washed clean by rain. Collins watched her go, clutching the small bundle against his chest. Later that night, he opened it. Inside was one last letter, written in precise, trembling ink. "Daniel, I am going home, though home no longer exists. They say peace is won by men, but I think it is built by the ones who still dare to feel. If you ever remember me, do not remember the prisoner. Remember the woman who believed that even enemies can learn to be kind." Collins folded it carefully, sealed it in an envelope, and months later, when he returned to the States, he found Daniel Harper in a small town in Iowa, working at a lumber yard, quieter than before. When Daniel read the letter, he didn't speak for a long time. He walked outside, into the snow, and looked at the horizon, somewhere beyond the ocean. Spring would come again, cherry blossoms would bloom over graves, and Aiko Tanaka would stand among the ruins of her homeland, remembering a man who once looked at her not as an enemy, but as a soul. The war had taken everything, but it had also shown them the one truth that no flag could bury, that kindness, when born in the ashes of hatred, is the most defiant act of all. After the voyage, Japan appeared like a ghost of the nation Aiko remembered. The port of Yokohama was a skeleton, warehouses burned hollow, cranes twisted into iron ribs, streets littered with broken glass that glimmered like frozen tears. The women stepped off the transport trucks one by one, greeted not by family or celebration but by silence. People watched from the alleys, whispering. "POWs," someone muttered, the word like a stain. Aiko kept her head bowed. Every step back onto her homeland felt like trespassing. The guards turned them over to the local authorities, who handed each woman a ration card, a scrap of paper with her name, and a curt instruction: "Return home if you can." But home was gone. Aiko's family house in Nagasaki had been obliterated months before the surrender. Her parents' names appeared on a government casualty list pinned outside the municipal office. She stared at the paper until the ink blurred with her tears. She rented a small room above a noodle shop near the port. The air smelled of broth, seawater, and despair. At night, she could hear American soldiers laughing in the distance, their radios playing jazz. It felt cruel that music had returned while she still could not breathe freely. She found work sewing uniforms for demobilized soldiers. Her hands moved like machines, but her mind wandered to the garden in Okinawa, to Daniel's quiet eyes, to the letters she'd left behind. She wondered if he had read them. She wondered if he hated her for surviving. One afternoon, as she was leaving work, she ran into a man wearing a reporter's badge. He introduced himself as Kenji Mori, journalist for a new weekly called Reconstruction Chronicle. He had been a war correspondent and recognized her from a POW list that the U.S. Army had released. "You were in the Philippines camp, weren't you?" he asked. His voice was polite, but there was something sharp beneath it. Aiko hesitated. "Yes." He scribbled in his notebook. "There are rumors. They say some women collaborated with the Americans. Is that true?" Her heart froze. "We were prisoners. We did what we had to do to survive." "Survival is a convenient word," he said, smiling thinly. "People want heroes, not women who fed their enemies tea." She turned away, but he called after her. "You can't bury the past, Tanaka-san. The nation will dig it up." That night, she burned her old clothes in a metal basin behind the shop. The smoke stung her eyes, but she kept watching until the fabric turned to ash. Days passed. Food was scarce. She lived mostly on rice water and the kindness of her landlady, who sometimes left extra miso soup outside her door. Then one morning, a letter arrived. It was from the American embassy. Inside was a single sheet written in careful Japanese. "We wish to inform you that Sergeant Daniel Harper has submitted your name for humanitarian correspondence clearance under the Allied Reconciliation Initiative. If you consent, you may write him one letter. No return communication will be authorized." Aiko sat down slowly. Her hands trembled. She read the line again and again. One letter. That was all. That evening, by the dim light of an oil lamp, she began to write. "Daniel, it has been months since we saw the ocean between us. Japan is quiet now, too quiet. They look at us, the women who came back from captivity, as though we brought shame home with us. Perhaps they are right. But if shame means remembering kindness, then I will keep it gladly. I hope you are alive. I hope you have forgiven yourself for surviving. I have not." She sealed the letter carefully and walked to the embassy post office the next morning. The clerk took it without expression, stamped it, and dropped it into a canvas bag. She stood there long after it disappeared, as if the air might carry some echo of him back. Weeks passed. No answer came, as expected. Still, she wrote more letters, ones she would never send. They filled a small box under her bed. In December 1946, the war trials began in Tokyo. The newspapers screamed names. Generals, ministers, were criminals. One morning, a familiar name appeared. Captain Henry Ross, U.S. Army. He had been arrested for misconduct and unauthorized brutality toward prisoners. Aiko read the article twice, stunned. The charges stemmed from testimonies of soldiers under his command, including one, Private James Collins. The report said Ross had died by suicide before the hearing. Collins had left the service shortly after. For the first time in months, Aiko felt a strange mixture of sorrow and vindication. The war was not over. It was still devouring its own children. Spring returned slowly. Cherry blossoms bloomed over the riverbanks. One evening, she walked to a small shrine near the ruins of the old naval base. Incense drifted through the air. An old priest greeted her kindly. "You pray for someone lost?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "Someone I will never meet again." The priest smiled faintly. "Then you are luckier than most. Many pray for those they cannot even remember." As she bowed, she felt a breeze lift her hair, and for an instant she imagined Daniel's voice in the wind. She did not know whether he had received her letter or if he still remembered the woman behind the wire fence. But she carried him with her, the way the sea carries salt long after the waves have gone. Years later, when Japan began to rebuild and factories hummed again, she took a job as a teacher in a small coastal town. Her students were the children of widows and orphans. She taught them English, and sometimes, when they laughed at her accent, she smiled. One day, a student asked why she chose such a difficult language. "Because," she said after a pause, "words can be bridges." The children nodded, not understanding fully, but they would remember the warmth in her voice. That summer, she received a small parcel from the United States. No sender's name, only a return code from Iowa. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a pressed cherry blossom petal. The note read simply, "I received your letter. Peace is harder than war, but I am trying. DH." She pressed the blossom to her lips. Outside, cicadas sang, and for the first time since the surrender, she allowed herself to cry, not from grief, but from the strange relief of knowing that somewhere across the ocean, kindness had survived. Daniel Harper hadn't slept properly since the war ended. The nightmares came in flashes, mud, sirens, faces half buried in earth. But more than the horrors of the battlefield, what haunted him most was her face behind the barbed wire. Sometimes he'd see her standing in the garden, wind in her hair, and he'd wake drenched in sweat, unsure whether it had been memory or dream. He lived in a small town in Iowa now, working at a lumber yard. The war had made him older than his 28 years. His mother said he looked like a man carved from wood, sturdy on the outside, hollow within. The local people liked to thank him for his service, and he smiled and nodded, but every thank you felt like a wound reopening. When the letter came from the Allied Correspondence Program, he read it 100 times before he believed it was real. Her handwriting was delicate, careful, the same he remembered on those notes she used to hide in her apron. He sat by the window of his mother's house and read her words aloud to the empty room. Each sentence carried the sound of rain and longing. He could almost smell the sea again. That night, he went for a walk through the snow-covered fields, the letter tucked in his coat pocket. He thought of how she had stood in that camp, defiant, even in hunger, and how he'd turned away when she called his name. He had done it to protect her, but it had felt like betrayal. The next weeks, he carried her letter everywhere. At work, he would touch the envelope in his pocket whenever the saws screamed too loud, whenever guilt began to creep back. He started writing back on scraps of paper during lunch breaks, though he knew he wasn't allowed to send anything more. "You said peace feels quiet. It does here, too, but it's an empty quiet. I wonder if the heart ever stops fighting." He kept the notes hidden under a loose floorboard, the same way she had once done. One evening, his mother found him sitting by the radio, staring into nothing. "You're far away again," she said softly. "Where do you go, Danny?" He hesitated. "Back there. To the war." He shook his head. "To someone I left behind." His mother touched his shoulder gently. "Then maybe it's time you stop leaving." The idea began to grow in him, a dangerous thought that wouldn't go away. He had money saved, enough for a ticket. The war was over. Civilians could travel again. But returning to Japan, to the land that had taken his friends, his sleep, his youth, it felt like madness. Yet every night, the wind whispered her name. In early spring of 1947, he packed a small suitcase, took the train to San Francisco, and boarded a ship bound for Tokyo Bay. The ocean looked calmer than he remembered. The other passengers, mostly soldiers and aid workers, talked about rebuilding, about democracy, about the future. Daniel stood on deck staring eastward, his heart heavier than his luggage. When the ship docked, the sight that met him was devastation and rebirth tangled together. Streets full of rubble, but also children flying paper kites. Vendors selling rice balls beside ruins. Life, stubborn and beautiful, he reported to the U.S. Occupation Office, offering his services as a translator. He had learned enough Japanese from his time in the camps. The officer who interviewed him raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this, Harper? Most guys can't wait to forget." "I'm not most guys," Daniel said quietly. He was assigned to a reconstruction bureau in Yokohama, where his job was to inspect repatriation camps and file reports. On his first day, he walked past the very building where Aiko's transport had once arrived. The sight made his knees weak. He imagined her stepping off the truck, thin, proud, carrying her shame like armor. That night, he went to a small tea house near the harbor. The owner was a gray-haired woman with kind eyes. She served him sake without asking questions. As he drank, he overheard two dock workers talking about a former POW woman who now taught children in a nearby coastal town. The description, Japanese, late 20s, quiet, taught English, made his pulse quicken. He asked, trying to sound casual, "Do you know her name?" One of the men shrugged. "Tanaka, maybe. She lives near the old naval ruins." The world seemed to stop spinning. The next day, Daniel took a train along the coast. carrying only a small bag and the letter she had written him. The journey was long, the landscape a patchwork of ruin and rebirth. Villages rebuilding with bamboo and tin, farmers planting rice where craters once were. By late afternoon, he arrived at the town. It was peaceful, framed by hills and the sea. He found the school easily. It was just a wooden building with paper windows and children's laughter spilling out that he waited outside until the classes ended. When she finally stepped out, he almost didn't recognize her. She looked older, thinner, dressed in a simple gray kimono, hair tied neatly back. But when she turned, when the wind lifted her face toward him, it was her. For a moment, he couldn't move. The world narrowed to the sound of her footsteps on gravel. She saw him, froze, blinked once as if doubting her own eyes. Then she whispered, "Daniel?" He nodded, voice breaking. "You got my letter." Tears welled up instantly. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Laughter and sobs tangled in her throat. "You came back." "I had to," he said. "The war took too much already. I wasn't going to let it take this, too." They stood there for a long moment, two ghosts learning to be human again. The children peeked from the doorway, giggling at the sight of the foreigner, but Aiko didn't care. She stepped forward until the distance between them was gone that he reached into his coat and handed her a small wooden box. Inside was the cherry blossom petal she had sent him, perfectly preserved. "I kept it," he said. "It reminded me that something beautiful could survive even after fire." She looked down at it, trembling. "All my life, they told me enemies could not love without betraying their country. But maybe kindness is its own nation." The sun was sinking behind the hills, turning the sky gold. He took her hand carefully, afraid she might vanish if he held too tightly. "Then let's build that nation," he said. For the first time since the war began, she smiled without fear. That evening, they walked together along the beach. The sea hissed softly against the sand. No guards, no fences, no orders. Just two souls who had finally found peace in the same silence that once divided them. As dusk deepened, he said quietly, "The world won't understand." "Then let the world rebuild itself," she answered. "We have rebuilt enough pain." He laughed, the sound rusty but real. And there, beneath the bruised pink of the setting sky, Daniel Harper and Aiko Tanaka stood side by side, no longer prisoner and soldier, but two survivors who had learned the most difficult truth of war. That love, when born out of ruin, is not weakness, but resistance. They met in secret for weeks, hiding their happiness as if it were contraband. Daniel stayed in a boarding house run by an old fisherman who rented rooms to foreigners. Aiko would visit late in the evening, after her classes ended, walking through narrow lantern-lit alleys where the air smelled of salt and cedar. They talked quietly, drank weak tea, and laughed at how unnatural it felt to be free. He was working as a translator for the Reconstruction Bureau, traveling to nearby towns to inspect records. Every time he left, she feared he wouldn't come back. Every time he returned, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor made her heart race. They never said they were in love. They didn't need to. It hung in the air between them, gentle and certain, the way light lingers long after sunset. But peace, like war, had its spies. It began with whispers in the market. A foreigner was seen walking with a Japanese woman by the beach. A schoolteacher was visiting an American after dark. The gossip grew until it reached the ears of the local police chief, a man still bitter that Japan had surrendered. One afternoon, as Aiko was leaving the school, she found two officers waiting by the gate. "Tanaka Aiko," one said sternly. "You are requested at the district office for questioning." She followed them without protest. Inside, the room smelled of tobacco and damp paper. The police chief sat behind a desk, his uniform freshly pressed. "You are consorting with an American soldier," he said without preamble. "Do you deny it?" She bowed slightly. "He is not a soldier anymore. He helps with reconstruction. Call it what you like," the man said coldly. "Women like you are a stain on our recovery. Do you think the people will respect a teacher who shares her bed with the enemy?" Her face burned, but she kept her voice steady. "He is not my enemy. The war is over." He leaned forward, eyes hard. "The war may be over, but honor is not." They released her after an hour, but word spread quickly. The next day, the head of the school called her into his office. He was an old man with kind eyes, but fear had replaced kindness. "Tanaka-san," he said, "the parents have complained." They do not want their children taught by a collaborator. I am not a collaborator, she whispered. I am a woman who refused to keep hating. He sighed. I know, but this town is small. People remember too much. You must go. She bowed, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Thank you for your kindness. When she told Daniel that evening, he went pale. We'll leave, he said immediately. There are cities that don't care. Tokyo, maybe. But she shook her head. You don't understand. It's not just here. It's the air we breathe. The people think love is betrayal. Then let them, he said fiercely. We fought a war so the world could be free. We can't hide like prisoners. She touched his hand gently. You can afford to defy them. You'll go home. They'll call you a hero. I'll stay here, and they'll call me shame. He stood and began pacing. Then I'll stay too. I'll build houses, plant trees, anything. I won't leave you to face this alone. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and bright all at once. Do you know what they'll do if they find out we live together? They'll take your work, your papers. They'll call you unfit to serve. I don't care, he said. I lost too much pretending to care about what people think. For a long time they sat in silence, the rain tapping softly on the roof. Finally she said, There's a village north of here. My father's cousin lives there. We could go for a while. He nodded. Then we go. That night, they packed what little they had. A few clothes, his papers, her notebooks, the wooden box with the cherry blossom. They took a train at dawn, sitting in separate cars so as not to draw attention. The journey was long and quiet. Mountains rose like old gods outside the window. When they arrived, the village was small and half empty, its houses leaning against the wind. Her cousin, an elderly farmer named Sato, welcomed them without questions. You can stay in the guest room, he said. People talk too much, but the land does not. Days became weeks. They worked in the fields, mended fences, repaired roofs. The rhythm of labor dulled the noise of the outside world. In the evenings, they cooked rice and sat by the fire, talking about nothing and everything. How different the stars looked here. How silence could feel like a gift point one morning. Sato came in from the market with a newspaper folded under his arm. They wrote about you, he said quietly, setting it down. Daniel picked it up. The headline read, American occupation officer accused of improper relations with former POW. His name wasn't printed, but the description was clear enough that he read the article twice, then crumpled it in his fist. They can't leave us alone, he muttered. Aiko took his hand. They won't, because they need someone to hate. If they stop hating you, they have to face what they became. He looked at her, grief and admiration colliding in his chest. And what did we become? She smiled faintly. Human. Weeks later, an American jeep arrived at the farm. Two officers stepped out, crisp uniforms glinting in the sunlight. They carried orders from Tokyo. Daniel was to return to headquarters immediately. No explanation given. Sato stood in the doorway as they spoke, frowning. They're taking you? Daniel looked at Aiko. Her face was unreadable. I'll come back, he said quickly. I promise. She nodded, but her eyes were already wet. They'll make it hard for you. Promise me you won't fight them. I've been fighting my whole life, he said. I just started fighting for the right thing. They let him pack one bag. Before he left, she slipped a folded note into his hand. Don't open it until you reach Tokyo, she said. He kissed her forehead and whispered, I'll find a way back. The jeep rumbled away, leaving her standing in the dust. The mountains were quiet. She didn't cry until the sound of the engine had vanished on the road to Tokyo. He unfolded the note. It read, If they send you away, remember this. Peace was never meant to be given. It's something we build, one act of kindness at a time. Even if we are apart, keep building. He folded it carefully and tucked it next to her old letter in his breast pocket. Back in Tokyo, he was stripped of his assignment and ordered to return to the United States. Conflict of interest, the colonel said curtly. You compromised your position. Daniel stared at the man across the desk. I fell in love with someone who lost everything. If that's a compromise, then maybe the system's broken. The colonel's expression didn't change. You have 48 hours to leave Japan. That night, Daniel walked through the neon-lit streets, the smell of grilled fish and diesel thick in the air. The city was alive again, laughing, rebuilding, but to him, it felt hollow. He bought a postcard with Mount Fuji printed on it, turned it over, and wrote in small, neat letters, They say the ocean divides us. I say it remembers us. He mailed it to the village. 2 weeks later, Aiko received it. She read it under the apricot tree behind Sato's house, the petals falling like snow around her. She pressed the card to her heart and whispered, "Then let the ocean keep our story." Years would pass before they saw each other again, but neither forgot. He carried her letters across oceans. She carried his memory through rebuilding Japan. It was 1952 when he saw her again. The war had been over for 7 years, but it lived quietly inside them both, like a scar hidden beneath new skin. Daniel had built a small life in San Francisco, a modest apartment, a job at a shipping firm, the polite distance of neighbors who never asked too many questions. He didn't marry. He couldn't. Every time he tried to picture a future, her face appeared. Aiko, standing barefoot on the shore, the wind pulling at her hair, he told himself she had forgotten him. That she had built a life in Japan, maybe married, maybe had children who looked like her. That was the only way he could stand the silence. But on an early summer morning, while sorting cargo manifests, he overheard his manager mention a Japanese education delegation visiting the States. "They're coming to study the new school systems," the man said. "Landing in Oakland next week." Daniel froze. He didn't ask why, didn't even think. He requested a few days off and bought a train ticket to Oakland. The ride felt longer than the voyage across the Pacific years before. He watched the hills roll past, trying not to hope too much, but his heart beat like a drum that refused to quiet. At the port terminal, officials milled about in crisp uniforms, translators calling out names. The delegation descended the gangway, men and women in neat suits, carrying briefcases and shy smiles. He scanned every face, telling himself this was foolish, she wouldn't be here. And then, through the crowd, he saw her. She wore a pale blue dress and a hat that shadowed her eyes, but he knew. The same stillness, the same calm strength in the way she walked. For a moment, the noise around him faded. He took a step forward, then stopped, afraid the world would correct itself and she'd vanish like a dream. She turned, as if sensing him. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face, and then tears filled her eyes so quickly he thought his heart might stop. They stood frozen for what felt like a lifetime before she moved first, crossing the space between them. He met her halfway. Neither spoke. Words would have ruined the silence that had carried them through the years. When she finally whispered, her voice trembled. "You're real." He laughed, the sound rough and breaking. "So are you." They found a quiet cafe near the pier. It smelled of coffee and sea salt. For a while, they just sat facing each other, afraid to blink. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out the old cherry blossom petal, now pressed between glass. "I kept it," she said. He smiled. "So did I." He showed her his wallet, where a folded note, her handwriting faint but still legible, had traveled with him through every job. Every empty night, they talked until the cafe closed, about everything and nothing. About the years she spent rebuilding schools, the children she'd taught, the letters she never sent because she believed he was gone. About how she'd joined the education board to help women like her find dignity again. And he told her about the lumber yards, about the restless guilt, about how he'd returned once to Japan but never found the courage to look for her again. She listened, her eyes soft and wet. "Maybe it's better," she said. "If we had met sooner, the world would have taken it from us again." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "And now," she said quietly, "the world is tired of hating." For the next few weeks, they walked through the city together, Fisherman's Wharf, Golden Gate Park, the quiet streets lined with jacaranda trees. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer haunted. It was gentle, full of what they had survived. One afternoon, standing by the pier, Aiko watched the ships glide out to sea. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "that the ocean remembers us?" "I think it carried us back here," he said. "You and I, we were always just tides waiting for the same shore." She smiled through tears. "Then this time, let's stay." He nodded, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I can't promise forever. The world might still have opinions." "Let it," she said, her voice steady. "We've lived through worse." They rented a small apartment near Chinatown, a place with peeling walls and a view of the bay. She cooked rice with soy sauce and pickled plums. He brewed coffee every morning. When they walked down the street together, some people stared, but most looked away. It no longer mattered. In the quiet hours before dawn, They would sit by the window and watch fog roll over the city. Sometimes she read poetry aloud, in Japanese, slow and melodic. Sometimes he just listened, memorizing the sound of her voice. Months passed. The cherry blossom she'd brought with her began to fade. He placed it in a glass frame above their bed. "It's our proof," he said, "that something beautiful survived the fire." Years later, when she fell ill, he cared for her the way he once wished someone had cared for all those who were lost. On her final morning, she asked him to open the window. The air smelled of salt and roses. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly. Not a single breath. She reached for his hand and whispered, "Promise me you'll take me back once more, to the sea." When she was gone, he did exactly that. He took her ashes to the coast, where the Pacific stretched endless and gray. He scattered them into the wind, and the breeze carried them gently. Like a whisper returning home, he stood there for a long time. Alone but not lonely. The tide came in, lapping around his boots, and he felt her presence, calm, forgiving, infinite. He thought of the years of war, of the camps, of the cruelty men justified in the name of flags. And he realized that their love had been the only victory worth having. As the sun dipped into the horizon, Daniel whispered, "The ocean remembers." And in the soft rhythm of the waves, he heard her reply, quiet but clear, "Always." The wind swept across the shore, carrying the scent of salt and cherry blossoms. The war was long over, but its last battle, between hatred and love, had finally found peace.